What happens when a frail veteran faces a jeering crowd and a cold-hearted principal at a school gate? You won't believe how 3 simple words silence everyone and turn the tide. I stood at the gate of Maplewood High School, my cane sinking slightly into the cracked asphalt, the weight of my 78 years pressing down on my shoulders. The late autumn sun was slipping low, painting the world in hues of amber and shadow, and the air carried a crisp bite that tugged at the frayed cuffs of my old gray coat. I'd worn this coat through winters harsher than this, through nights when the wind howled like the devil himself. But today it felt thinner, as if the cold wasn't just outside, but creeping into my bones. My fedora, tilted just so, shaded my eyes as I watched the students pour out of the school, their voices a wild tangle of laughter and shouts, their sneakers squeaking on the pavement. They were young, full of fire, oblivious to the weight of history I carried in my chest. I suppose that's how it should be. Youth don't know the cost of things yet. But I'd come here to teach them, or at least to try. My name's Walter Grayson, though nobody here knew it when I arrived. In my coat pocket, folded neat as a soldier's bunk, was a letter for Miss Evelyn Carter, the history teacher. I'd seen her notice on the community board down at the library, asking for veterans to share their stories for Veterans Day. Something stirred in me when I read it, a memory of frozen hills in Korea, of boys who never came home, of a purple heart I keep in a drawer because it feels too heavy to wear. I'm not one for speeches or grand gestures. Never was. But I figured I could tell those kids a thing or two about what it means to stand for something bigger than yourself. So I wrote the letter, my hand shaking a bit from the arthritis, and walked the 2 miles from my apartment to deliver it. A small thing, I thought, a good thing. The kids didn't see it that way. A group of them brushed past me, their backpacks swinging like pendulums, their eyes barely registering the old man by the gate. One boy, lanky with a mop of dark hair, stopped and gave me a look that was half sneer, half curiosity. His name, I'd learn later, was Jake Thompson. "Yo, Grandpa!" he called, his voice sharp with that teenage bravado that thinks it's clever. "You lost or something?" His friend snickered, egging him on like a pack of hyenas. I smiled, the kind of smile you learn after years of facing bigger threats than a kid's mouth. "Just waiting to see a teacher, son," I said, keeping my tone even, like I was talking to one of my old squad mates. Jake rolled his eyes, tossing a half-empty soda can toward a trash bin. It missed, clattering onto the pavement with a hollow clang, and he didn't bother to pick it up. I watched that can roll, my jaw tightening. Litter's a small sin, but it's a sign of carelessness, and I've seen where carelessness leads. Inside the school, I could hear the echo of the final bell. The hallways alive with the chaos of kids grabbing their things, teachers shouting last-minute instructions. Through a window, I caught a glimpse of the principal, Leonard Brooks, hunched over his desk, his face set in that bureaucratic scowl I've seen on men who love rules more than people. He glanced out, saw me standing there like some relic from a history book, and muttered something to his secretary, a woman named Donna Reed. I couldn't hear them, but I could guess the gist. "What's that old man doing here?" I've been invisible to folks like that before. Age does that to you, makes you a shadow in a world that worships youth. But I've carried heavier burdens than their indifference. The air shifted when a security guard approached, a big fella named Carl Dempsey, broad as a barn door and twice as heavy. His boots thudded on the asphalt, and his eyes sized me up like I was a stray dog. "Hey, sir," he said, his voice all business, no warmth. "This is school property. You got business here or you need to move along?" I looked up at him, my eyes still sharp despite the years. "I'm here to see Miss Evelyn Carter," I said, patting my coat pocket where the letter sat. "Got something for her." Carl squinted, his lip curling like he smelled something sour. "Yeah? You got ID? Can't just let anyone wander around a school these days." Fair enough, I thought. Rules are rules. I reached for my wallet, slow and deliberate, my fingers stiff from the cold. But Carl's patience was thinner than my coat. "Look, Pops," he snapped, "if you don't have a real reason, I'm going to ask you to leave. Rules are rules." That word, Pops hit me like a jab to the ribs. I've been called worse, mind you, but there's something about being dismissed like that, like you're nothing but a nuisance, that cuts deeper than it should. I understand rules, son, I said, pulling out my ID. Served my country to protect 'em. My voice was calm, but there was steel in it. The kind forged in places like Hill 812, where I learned what it means to stand your ground. Carl barely glanced at the card, waving it off like it was a bus ticket. Yeah, whatever, he muttered, turning away. Wait here. I'll check with the office. He walked off, muttering about old-timers wasting time, and I felt that old familiar ache in my leg, the one that never quite healed after Korea. Not from the cold, but from the weight of being invisible. The kids came back, circling like vultures. Jake was at the front, his grin sharp as a blade. "What's up, Carl? This guy causing trouble?" he asked, leaning in like he was in on some big joke. Carl shrugged, his annoyance plain. Says he's got a letter for Carter. Probably some scam. That word, scam, was a punch to the gut. I straightened, my grip tightening on my cane until my knuckles whitened. "I fought for this country, boy," I said, my voice low, each word deliberate. "I'm no scam." Jake laughed, loud and showy, like he was performing for the crowd. "Sure, Grandpa, you look like you fought in, like, World War I or something." His friends howled, one of them, Tyler, I'd learn, mimicking my limp, hobbling in an exaggerated circle. The crowd of students grew, their phones out, capturing every second of my humiliation. I've faced gunfire, seen men fall, but this was a different kind of battle, and it stung in ways I hadn't expected. Across the parking lot, a woman in an SUV watched, her face tight with unease. Sarah Mitchell, her name was, though I didn't know it then. She gripped her steering wheel, her knuckles pale, torn between stepping in and staying out of it. I saw her hesitation, and I didn't blame her. Folks don't like wading into messes like this, not when it's easier to look away. But I've learned something in my years. You don't survive war by looking away. You stand, you face it, and you hold your ground. So I did, my cane steady, my eyes fixed on the kids, on Carl, on the world that seemed to have forgotten what respect means. Inside, Evelyn Carter was packing her bag, her classroom a quiet oasis in the storm of the school's chaos. She was a good woman, I could tell. The kind who cares about the past and what it teaches. Carl poked his head in, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Some old guy at the gate says he's got a letter for you," he said. "Looks like he's causing a scene. Kids are giving him a hard time." Evelyn's brow furrowed, her hands pausing over her bag. "An old man? Did he say his name?" Carl shrugged, like it wasn't worth his time. "Didn't ask. You want me to handle it?" Evelyn grabbed her coat, her instincts telling her something was wrong. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'll handle it." She reached the gate just as Jake and his crew upped the ante, tossing pebbles near my feet, daring me to react. One skimmed my shoe, and I felt the old anger stir, the kind I'd buried deep after the war. But I've learned to leash it, to let it simmer instead of boil. Evelyn's voice cut through the noise, sharp as a sergeant's command. "Hey!" she shouted, her eyes blazing. "What's going on here?" The boys froze, Jake's smirk faltering. I looked at her, my face steady, though my heart was pounding. "Just came to give you this, ma'am," I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. My hand shook, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back the rage at being treated like this. Evelyn took the letter, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting I'd labored over. "Mr. Grayson," she said, reading my name, "you're the veteran who called about the talk." Before I could answer, Jake snorted, his voice dripping with scorn. "Veteran? Yeah, right. He's probably just begging for attention." Carl chuckled, and I felt the crowd's eyes on me. Some curious, some cruel. Evelyn's glare could have burned a hole through them both. "That's enough," she snapped. "Show some respect." But the damage was done. My jaw tightened, and the air grew thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. The kids' laughter faded, and even Jake looked unsure, like he'd stepped on something he didn't understand. Evelyn opened the letter, her eyes widening as she read my words, my service, my purple heart, my offer to share a piece of history. She looked up, her voice softening. "Mr. Grayson, I'm so sorry for this. Please, come inside." I shook my head, my pride holding me fast. "I'll wait, ma'am," I said, my voice steady but laced with something deeper, something that made her pause. I'd come here to do something good, and I wasn't about to let a few loudmouths drive me off. The crowd grew, drawn by the spectacle, but I stood taller, my cane a quiet anchor. I've faced worse than this. Mortars, frostbite, the screams of men I couldn't save. But standing here, mocked and dismissed, I felt the weight of a different war, one fought with words and indifference. And I wasn't about to lose. The cold was biting harder now, gnawing at my joints like an old enemy. I stood by the gate of Maplewood High School, my cane a steady anchor in the cracked asphalt, my old gray coat doing little to keep out the autumn chill. The sun was sinking fast, casting long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the parking lot. The kids' voices swirled around me, a storm of laughter and taunts, their phones glinting as they recorded my every move. I'd come to deliver a letter to Miss Evelyn Carter, a simple offer to share my story as a Korean War veteran. But simplicity has a way of unraveling when pride and ignorance get involved. Jake Thompson and his pack of loudmouths were circling, their jeers sharper now, and Carl Dempsey, the security guard, stood by with his arms crossed, his face a mask of smug indifference. I felt the weight of their disdain, heavy as the rifle I once carried, but I've faced worse than this. You don't survive a war by bending to the wind. Evelyn was holding my letter, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the injustice unfolding before her. She was a good woman, I could tell. Her eyes burned with a fire that comes from caring too much. "Jake, Tyler, stop it. Now!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the crowd like a whip. But those boys, Jake and his wiry sidekick Tyler Brooks, didn't back down. Jake tossed another pebble, watching it skitter across the pavement near my feet, his grin sharp enough to cut glass. "Hey, old man," he called, "why don't you shuffle back to the nursing home? Save us all some trouble." His friends howled, one of them mimicking my limp with an exaggerated hobble, drawing more laughs. I kept my eyes on them, steady as a sniper's aim, but inside, my blood was simmering. Not boiling. Not yet. I've learned to keep that fire in check, but it doesn't mean it's gone out. "Young man," I said, my voice low, measured, like I was addressing a green recruit. "I've stood in places that'd make you rethink that mouth of yours." Jake snorted, undeterred. "Yeah? Like where? The bingo hall?" The crowd laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now, like some of them sensed they were crossing a line they didn't fully understand. Evelyn stepped closer, her face flushed with righteous anger. "That's enough!" she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "This man is a veteran. Show some respect." But respect was a foreign word to Jake, and Carl wasn't helping. He shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the ground, and fixed me with a look that said I was more trouble than I was worth. "Look, Pops," he said, his tone sharp as barbed wire. "You're causing a disturbance. I'm going to have to escort you off the property." That word, Pops, hit me again, like a jab to an old wound. I've taken bullets, seen men bleed out in the snow, but being dismissed like some frail nuisance stung in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I came to deliver a letter," I said, my voice steady, though my grip on my cane tightened until my knuckles ached. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Carl's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, his hand hovering near my arm like he was ready to grab me. "Trouble's what you're getting," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Rules are rules, and you're breaking them." I pulled back, my bad leg wobbling just enough to make my cane scrape the asphalt. The crowd gasped, a ripple of unease running through them, and Evelyn surged forward. "Carl, don't you dare touch him!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fury. But Carl didn't flinch, his hand still hovering, his bulk a silent promise of force. The air was thick now, heavy with the weight of what was happening. Across the parking lot, Sarah Mitchell, the woman I'd noticed earlier, was out of her SUV, her face tight with outrage. She stood frozen, one hand on her car door, torn between stepping in and staying out of it. I didn't blame her. Folks don't like wading into messes like this, not when it's easier to turn away. But I've learned something in my years. You don't survive a firefight by turning away. You face it, you hold your ground, and you wait for the moment to strike back. So I stood, my cane planted, my eyes fixed on Carl, on Jake, on the crowd that saw me as nothing but an old man out of place. Then Leonard Brooks, the principal, came striding out of the school, his face set in a scowl that could have curdled milk. He was a man who loved his rules, you could tell. His suit pressed, his beard trimmed, his eyes cold with authority. His secretary, Donna Reed, must have tipped him off, because he looked like he'd been dragged from his paperwork and wasn't happy about it. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice slicing through the noise like a bayonet. Jake, ever the opportunist, jumped in. "This old guy's loitering, Mr. Brooks," he said, his tone dripping with fake innocence. "Says he's got some letter, but he's just stirring up trouble." Carl nodded, eager to back him up. "Told him to leave, but he's refusing," he said, his voice thick with annoyance. Evelyn stepped forward, clutching my letter like it was a lifeline. "Mr. Brooks, this is Walter Grayson," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "He's a veteran who offered to speak to my class for Veterans Day. He's not causing trouble. He's being harassed." Leonard's eyes flicked to me, taking in my worn coat, my cane, the stubborn set of my jaw. For a moment I thought he might listen, might see the man behind the age. But his expression hardened, and I knew I'd misjudged him. "Veteran or not, he's disrupting school grounds," he said, his voice cold as the wind. "We have protocols, Miss Carter. No unauthorized visitors." The words hit like a slap, and Evelyn's face flushed with indignation. "This is wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "He's a Purple Heart recipient." But Leonard wasn't swayed. He raised a hand, cutting her off. "Enough. Mr. Grayson, you need to leave, or I'll call the police." The crowd went quiet, the threat hanging heavy in the air. Jake smirked, whispering to Tyler, "Told you he's nobody." I felt my jaw tighten, my old anger stirring like a beast waking up. "I've faced worse than this," I said, my voice low but clear, carrying the weight of battles fought long ago. "I came here to do something good. If that's a problem, so be it." Leonard's eyes narrowed, and he pulled out his phone, dialing with a flourish. "I'm calling the police," he said, his voice sharp. "You've got 5 minutes to leave." Carl stepped closer, his shadow falling over me, while Jake and his friends jeered. "5 minutes, Grandpa!" Jake taunted, tossing another pebble that struck my cane, making it wobble with a faint clack. I stood my ground, my heart pounding but my face calm. I've stood in foxholes with mortars screaming overhead. This was just another kind of war. Evelyn's hands shook as she clutched my letter, her voice rising. "Mr. Brooks, this is disgraceful! You can't do this!" But Leonard ignored her, speaking into his phone, requesting police for a trespasser. Sarah Mitchell couldn't stay silent any longer. She marched toward the gate, her voice booming across the lot. "You should be ashamed!" she shouted, pointing at Leonard. "This man's a veteran, and you're treating him like a criminal!" A few parents nodded, their murmurs growing into a low rumble of dissent. But Leonard's face was stone. "This is school business, ma'am," he said coldly. "Stay out of it." The crowd was a living thing now, pulsing with tension, some cheering Jake on, others starting to question the scene. A shy girl, Emily Harper, edged closer to Evelyn, her voice barely audible. "Is he really a veteran?" she asked, her eyes wide. Evelyn nodded, showing her the letter, and Emily's face changed, a flicker of respect breaking through her shyness. But Jake's voice drowned her out, his taunts relentless. I felt the weight of it all. The kid's cruelty, Carl's indifference, Leonard's arrogance. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what they stood for, what they'd forgotten. I've seen men die for less than the respect I was asking for. Then the police cruiser rolled in, its lights flashing but siren silent, cutting through the noise like a blade. 2 officers, Daniel Hayes and Maria Lopez, stepped out, their faces professional, but guarded. Leonard strode toward them, his voice clipped as he pointed at me. "He's refusing to leave," he said. "We need him removed." Officer Hayes approached, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "Sir, we've got a call about a disturbance. Can you explain why you're here?" I looked at him, my eyes steady despite the ache in my leg. "I came to give a letter to Miss Carter," I said, nodding toward Evelyn. "I'm a veteran. Thought I could share my story with her students. Didn't expect all this." Lopez glanced at Evelyn, who held up the letter. "He's telling the truth," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "This is a misunderstanding." But Leonard cut in, his voice sharp. "He's causing a scene, officers. I want him off school property." Jake and his friends cheered, their voices grating like nails on a chalkboard. I tightened my grip on my cane, memories flashing. Korea, the cold, the blood, the men I'd carried. I said nothing, but my silence was louder than their noise. Sarah stepped closer, her voice rising. "This is outrageous! You're humiliating a veteran!" The parents' murmurs grew louder, a tide turning, but Leonard stood firm, his eyes cold. Hayes raised a hand. "Let's all calm down," he said, his voice even. "Sir, can I see some ID?" I nodded, reaching for my wallet, my fingers stiff but steady. Before I could hand it over, Jake shouted, "Check it good, probably a fake." The crowd laughed, but the officers' faces stayed serious. Lopez took my ID, studying it carefully, her eyes flicking to me with a hint of curiosity. I looked back, my heart steady despite the chaos. "Not your fault, ma'am," I said to Evelyn, my voice low. "Some folks don't know respect till it's taught." The words hung heavy, and the crowd waited, the tension coiling tighter, like a spring about to snap. The air at Maplewood High School's gate was thick as gunpowder, every word and glance charged with the weight of a battle I hadn't signed up for. I stood there, my cane planted firm in the asphalt, the cold seeping through my threadbare coat and into my bones, where old wounds ached with memories of Korea. The crowd, students, parents, onlookers, swirled around me, their voices a chaotic mix of jeers, murmurs, and the occasional cry of outrage. Jake Thompson and his pack of loudmouths were still at it, their taunts sharper now, egged on by the principal, Leonard Brooks, whose scowl was as rigid as his rulebook. Carl Dempsey, the security guard, loomed like a storm cloud, his arms crossed, his eyes daring me to make a move. Officers Daniel Hayes and Maria Lopez stood nearby, studying my ID, their faces unreadable but professional. Evelyn Carter clutched my letter, her eyes blazing with a fire I recognized, the kind that comes from seeing wrong and refusing to look away. Sarah Mitchell, the parent who'd stepped up, was rallying others, her voice cutting through the noise like a bugle call. I felt the weight of it all, heavy as the rifle I carried on Hill 812. But I've faced worse. You don't survive a war by flinching. Officer Lopez handed my ID back, her eyes softer now, like she'd seen something in me that the others missed. "Mr. Grayson, your ID checks out," she said, her voice calm but firm, like a good lieutenant keeping the line steady. "Can you confirm why you're here?" I nodded, my breath catching a bit from the cold. "I wrote a letter to Miss Carter," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my leg. "Offered to talk to her students about Korea, my service, my Purple Heart. Thought it might mean something to them." My words were plain, but they carried the weight of years, of frostbitten nights, of men I'd carried, of losses I still carried in my chest. Lopez paused, her gaze holding mine, and I saw a flicker of respect there. "The kind you earn," not demand. She turned to Leonard. "Sir, this sounds like a misunderstanding. He's not a threat." Leonard's face went red, like a kettle about to boil over. "I don't care who he says he is," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the crowd's murmur. "He's disrupting school property. Remove him." Jake, sensing blood in the water, shouted, "Yeah, get him out of here!" His friends laughed, one tossing another pebble that skittered near my feet, the clack echoing like a distant gunshot. I kept my eyes on the horizon, my jaw tight, memories of war flashing. Snow, blood, the screams of men I couldn't save. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice trembling with fury. "Mr. Brooks, this is shameful," she said, holding up my letter like it was evidence in a court of law. "He's a hero, and you're treating him like a criminal." Sarah Mitchell's voice joined hers, loud and fierce from the edge of the crowd. "You're embarrassing this school." A few parents nodded, their murmurs growing into a low rumble, but Leonard waved them off like they were flies. "This is my call," he said, his voice cold as the wind. "Officers, do your job." I felt the sting of it, sharp and familiar, like the bite of shrapnel. I've stood in foxholes, faced enemy fire, but this indifference, this dismissal, was a wound of a different kind. "I've seen men die for less than what you're throwing away," I said, my voice low but clear, carrying the weight of battles long past. Leonard's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a new sound cut through the chaos, a low, steady rumble, like thunder rolling in from a distant storm. Heads turned, and the crowd went quiet, the jeers dying in their throats. Jake's smirk faltered, and Carl shifted, his confidence cracking like thin ice. A black SUV with tinted windows rolled into the parking lot, followed by a sleek van with military plates, the kind that make you stand a little straighter. My heart stirred, not with hope but with recognition. I knew that sound, that presence. I'd felt it before, in places where men like me stood together or fell alone. The SUV's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his crew cut silver but his frame still strong, his suit tailored but unable to hide the soldier he'd been. Colonel Nathan Harper, though I hadn't seen him in decades. Behind him, two younger men in crisp uniforms emerged from the van, their movements precise, their faces set like men on a mission. Nathan's eyes found mine, and for a moment, the years fell away. Korea, Hill 812. The night I carried him through enemy fire, my leg bleeding, his breath ragged. "Walter Grayson," he said, his voice booming with the authority of a man who'd led battalions. I nodded, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "Nathan," I said, simple as that, like we were back in the mess hall swapping stories over bad coffee. The crowd stirred, confused, sensing something bigger than their small drama. Nathan turned to the officers, his presence like a wall you don't argue with. "I'm Colonel Nathan Harper, retired U.S. Army," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "This man is a decorated veteran, and I'm here to ensure he's treated with the respect he deserves." Leonard's mouth opened, but nothing came out, like a fish gasping on dry land. Jake and his friends exchanged nervous glances, their bravado leaking away like air from a punctured tire. Evelyn clutched my letter tighter, her eyes wide with something like hope. Sarah stepped closer, her voice triumphant. "See? I told you!" The officers exchanged a look, reassessing the situation like good soldiers reading the battlefield. Hayes spoke first. "Colonel, can you explain your connection to Mr. Grayson?" Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "I served with him in Korea. He saved my life on Hill 812. Carried me 2 miles through enemy fire with a bullet in his leg. That's the man you're trying to arrest." The crowd gasped, the sound rippling through them like a shock wave. I felt their eyes on me, not mocking now, but searching, like they were seeing me for the first time. A shy girl, Emily Harper, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Wait! Colonel Harper! That's my grandfather!" she said, her eyes wide with pride. The connection hit like a grenade, tying her to this moment, to me, to a history she'd only read about. Jake's face went pale, and Tyler muttered something, backing away like he'd stepped into a minefield. Carl looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Nathan turned to Leonard, his voice cutting like a bayonet. "You called this man a trespasser. You let these kids mock a hero. You should be ashamed." Leonard stammered, his authority crumbling like dry clay. I didn't know," he said, his voice weak. "We have rules." Nathan cut him off, sharp and final. "Rules don't trump honor. You owe this man an apology." The crowd murmured, the tide turning fully against Leonard. Parents started clapping, the sound growing into a steady rhythm, like a drum roll for justice. Students who'd been silent joined in, their phones lowering as they felt the shift. I stood there, my cane steady, my heart pounding, but my face calm. I didn't need their applause, but I won't lie. It felt good, like a weight lifting off my chest. I looked at the crowd, at Jake, at Carl, at Leonard, and I spoke, my voice quiet but heavy, the kind that carries over battlefields. "Respect costs nothing," I said. "That's all I ask." Those 3 words hung in the air, simple but sharp, like a blade cutting through the noise. The crowd went silent, the weight of them sinking in. Jake's head dropped, his bravado gone. Just a kid now, small and ashamed. Carl stared at the ground, his hands fidgeting like he didn't know what to do with them. Leonard's face was red, his phone slipping back into his pocket, his authority in tatters. Evelyn stepped forward, tears in her eyes, her voice soft but fierce. "Mr. Grayson, I'd be honored if you'd speak to my class. Tomorrow, if you're willing." I looked at her, my anger softening, replaced by something warmer. "I'd like that, ma'am," I said, my voice steady. Nathan clapped a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that took me back to nights in Korea, when we'd leaned on each other to survive. "I'll be there too," he said, glancing at Emily, who beamed with pride. "This man's story deserves to be heard." Officer Lopez turned to Leonard, her voice firm. "We're done here. No charges, no trespassing. This was a mistake." Hayes nodded, tipping his hat to me. "Sorry for the trouble, sir. Thank you for your service." I gave a small nod, the kind you give when words aren't needed. The officers headed back to their cruiser, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. Leonard muttered something about reviewing protocols and slunk toward the school, his head low. Carl slipped away, his shadow shrinking. Jake and his friend stood frozen, their earlier arrogance replaced by silence. Emily approached, her voice shy but sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson," she said. "I can't wait to hear your story." I smiled just a bit. "It's just history, young lady," I said, "but it's worth knowing." Sarah came up, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a hero, Mr. Grayson. I'm so sorry for what happened." I waved it off, my hand stiff from the cold. "No need, ma'am. Just glad it's settled." The crowd started to thin, some parents lingering to shake my hand, their apologies quiet but genuine. I felt the weight of their respect, not loud like the applause, but steady, like a good rifle in your hands. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and shadow, I turned to leave, Nathan at my side. We walked slowly, our steps in sync, like we were back in the ranks, brothers forged in fire. The crowd watched, their voices fading into a respectful hush. Jake stood alone, kicking at the pavement, his head low. Leonard was gone, his reputation as broken as his pride. Evelyn held my letter, already planning how she'd introduce me to her students, not just as a veteran, but as a man who'd stood tall against a world that tried to push him down. I didn't look back. My cane tapped softly on the asphalt, each step a quiet victory. I'd come to share a piece of myself, and though the road was harder than I'd expected, I'd done it with the same grit that got me through Korea. The gate of Maplewood High stood open behind me, a reminder that some battles are won not with fists, but with honor.